Okay, so it turns out that I have a few loose ends I'd like to tie up before I put this story to bed. And I guess the best place to start is with where we left off, with David Telfair McKim and his factory workers' reaction that he did. It's hard to say that I cherry-picked this article to try to make my point, because it's hard to interpret this article any other way. But there is plenty in here that supports the mainstream narrative, so I highly recommend reading the whole thing. But what I'd like to do is share the story of disgruntled slave James Winder, whose tale I cut short for length purposes in the last episode. He was a slave bought for life by McKim, which is a misnomer really, because the article is clear that McKim never intended to keep any slave for life, at least at his factory anyway. But James Winder, after about 2 years, making him one of the longer tenured slaves on site, decides he's had enough for whatever reason. The article doesn't really make that clear. And so he runs, only to be caught and returned a day and a half later. And it's from here his performance really drops off, leading up to that 6 weeks absence, for which he was not punished other than by eventually being sold. The article frames the James Winder story around the power struggle between slave and slave owner, because even though David McKim hired and fired shrewdly, he tended to hire single men. So trying to leverage family against production, strong-arming the slaves by saying that if they didn't work harder, they were going to be sold to someone in Georgia and they'll never see their family again and find out what real work is like. That type of threat didn't work for David McKim at his factory. And some of the slaves bonded around this and would be disruptive, calling the bluff dissentfully and encouraging others to do so, of which James Winder was one of these shirkers, as they were called. And so in this context, the notion that a slave could refuse work seems less bizarre. Still, some might ask why McKim could not invoke the threat of physical punishment. How could a slave, subject to the coercion of his master, refuse to work extra time? Winder and the others might have exercised considerable leverage in this realm. The slaves had considerable leverage, and the bosses have been trying to get it back ever since, right? But the most amazing part of this story to me is not this story of leverage, but in James Winder's name, because it's a name that he shares with our old friend William Winder, the lousy general who let D.C. burn, whom the Baron may have helped procure that appointment. Coincidence? Or did James Winder come from Slick Willie's stable? Slaves did take on the last names of their masters, didn't they? Or even better, could James Winder have been a shameful bastard son of William Winder and a slave? Could this have been the reason for the leniency McKim shows James Winder? I don't know. But interestingly enough, the article mentions several slaves by name, 3 others of which caught my eye. The first 2 are William Adams and Perry Tillman. Tillman is interesting because it's a big name in the Mud City paradigm. Tench Tillman is one of George Washington's closest confidants, and his sister Margaret Tillman, is the marrow-sucking wife of the barrister Charles Carroll. So could this Tillman have come from that Tillman stable? Again, is this apophenia running wild? Because I don't know if the Adams family has ties to the Mid-Atlantic region, but it wouldn't surprise me if this William Adams came from those Adamses. The third name I'm going to save for the finale. It just fits in too perfectly over there. It's just really interesting to see some of these names among his slaves, perhaps an indication to how tightly woven the McKims are in that narrative. I don't know. And so that's it for the story of David Telfair McKim and industrial slavery. But having Slick Willie Winder pop up, one thing I wanted to do but didn't at the time was to show you guys some of the weirdness in John Neal's pencil sketch of the first meeting of the Delphian Club, of which Slick Willie was a later member, and this club of 9 rotating members is largely responsible for what we think of as literature today, and that's hardly an exaggeration. And as talked about, the co-founder of the club was John Pierpont, J.P. Morgan's grandfather, who was a Unitarian minister, putting him right in the thick of everything that was going on Cathedral Hill. And it's interesting that his most famous poem is The Heirs of Palestine. And another thing I have to read now because it may fit into the finale as well. And so anyway, he's at the first meeting represented here in this sketch by John Neal. And so let's take a closer look at this sketch. Okay, so before we get going on this, I just have to preface it by saying that my failing eyes are not designed for this type of work, but let's see what kind of a high strangeness we can find in this pencil sketch of the inaugural meeting of the Delphian Club, the very first meeting of these literary geniuses, right? And it appears to have been quite a party for just 9 people, right? And, I have to kind of go with where my eyes are first drawn, and it's to this guy's dark hat, right? And he's clearly wearing a mask, Right? I think you can tell the type of mask I'm thinking of here. And even more unbelievable is that he has a word bubble. He's saying or singing something. I can't make it out though. If anybody can read any of that and decipher it, that would be amazing. But it's just interesting that he's singing or saying something here. Right? And it appears that he's not the only one in costume, because up here we have Paganini the clown, the crying clown. Right, here he is. And I don't know who this Joker is supposed to be. He looks rather frightening with this type of makeup and wig and costume or whatever, right? And he's got his hands in the magic top hat. And we've talked a little bit about top hats on this show, but interesting that this is going on. And over here, look at this guy or gal or whoever this is. This is an unbelievable look, clearly heavy in makeup with the lipstick and the dark eyes, in this big shawl or overcoat or whatever it is. This looks like a woman from the early 1900s to me, and not some gentleman, of high society. What's going on at this party? This guy down here, he seems to have had enough, and he's got a puke bucket just in case. Which is really unbelievable. And I can't even figure out what's going on over here with these two. Is this a woman slumped over, or a man dressed as a woman slumped over? This guy is clearly nodding out at the table. Over here we have what appears to be a doorway with a clock above it, or maybe even a fireplace, but I'm thinking more of a doorway given its height, right? The time is, at the time of this pencil sketching, appears to be either 2 minutes to midnight or 2 minutes after midnight. I don't know, it's right around that midnight or noon hour, perhaps. Who knows? This could be the middle of the day, but I doubt it. I don't know what type of bird or whatever this is supposed to be connecting to the clock. I can't tell, but I love this filigree down the side here because it's so reminiscent of the green men and the monstrous representations of Yaldabaoth that I find all over this city. And I think it's interesting that over here we have a portrait of a woman, or perhaps a reflection. I don't know. I can't tell if this is like a mirror or a painting, or what is that? I mean, it's just interesting that this is supposed to be an all men's club. And if that's the case, we have a couple who appear to be in drag at the very least, right? We got a costumed guy. We got a passed out guy, and I'm looking for 9, right? But I only see 8 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so would the 9th be this John Neal who's doing this pencil sketch? Or is this John Neal over here in a reflection and he's dressed in drag sketching this portrait? I don't know, but it's just really unbelievable to see what was going on. And I just want to mention that I think this is Shakespeare up here, or supposed to be anyway. I don't know when those portraits of Shakespeare started coming about, but kind of looks like what the portrait of Shakespeare to me. I don't know. That's what it makes me think of. Interesting that he would be, overseeing this, considering these are all the titans of literature of the day. Again, it cannot be overstated the importance of the Delphian Club and how literature rolls out in the latter half of the 19th century. Really kind of an amazing portrait of what was happening at this Delphian Club, at the Delphian Club's inaugural meeting. Just incredible. Which one of these people is John Pierpont? That's an amazing question to ponder. All right, so this is enough of this. I have a few more thoughts on the tableau party before we close this out that I wish I had gotten to this season. And that starts when I was first digging around in the Baltimore Sun trying to find out any information on these tableau waxworks parties. And I came across no fewer than 5 tableau parties that were thrown as fundraisers in 1870. None of which mentioned any of my ladies or Léonce Rabienne at all, which I found very interesting and led me to conclude that these tableau parties that Amy Darcy Wetmore is talking about here were private affairs held at either the Peabody or the Maryland clubs, or maybe even at Catherine Howard's house. I had really hoped to dive into these fundraisers, and it's unfortunate that I just couldn't get there because there are, again, other elements that I just couldn't get to. But I don't know how you can close out any story of the McKims and the tableau parties than with Emily McKim. This episode exists because I forgot to put this in the last one, like a dummy, right? And the story of Emily McKim, High Priestess of Diana and Colonial Pimpstress Extraordinaire, ends as ironically as it does in harmony with who she truly was, and that's childless. She left no living legacy to carry on her family or her family's story. honoring the chastity of her patron goddess, Diana. All right, that's it. All right, that's a wrap on the McKims and the tableau parties. We'll see you in the finale. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until then, cheers.